He's trying a bit more of the little green button there, and it looks like the dials are moving left, right, and centre. He's good. Happy days. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Very much for joining us today. Despite the inclement weather, I know it's been difficult for you, some of you, to get here, but thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. My name is Charles Goddard. I'm editorial director at The Economist Impact, and I'm here to welcome you to this session, Eliminating Marine Chemical Pollution, should I say, a roadmap for Japan and beyond. And I think just let me set a little bit of context for this first, I think. I think the ocean pollution, excuse me, I have to take my glasses off, I can't see my own notes. I think from an ocean pollution perspective, which is the focus of the work that we've been doing as a joint initiative with the Nippon Foundation in Back to Blue, the focus of most of the discussion around ocean pollution has been plastics. And there's very good reasons for that. And at the moment, as you know, there is a global treaty negotiation going on plastics at the United Nations. And a large part of that discussion and that negotiation is about the way in which chemicals in plastics are leaching into the environment from plastics. And this has become, I think, a really important part of that discussion, the health implications both for the environment and the ecology of both the land environment as well as the ocean, and for human health. I was at the plastic negotiations in Paris in March last year in INC2, where this issue of chemicals in plastics started to bubble up in the negotiations. And then, of course, during our own Global Plastics Summit, which we did with the Nippon Foundation in Bangkok in October last year, I think we saw a wide consensus developing, particularly amongst the negotiators, interestingly, as well as all of the civil society organizations, about the trouble, the concern that they have around chemicals in plastics. And so plastics, of course, is very, very important as a challenge that we face in the ocean, and the chemicals from plastics is, of course, a really interesting new development that we're beginning to understand and learn. But, and this is where I think this discussion is important today, Imagine, if you will, that this problem of chemicals is magnified from the problem that we have in plastics hundreds, if not thousands of times. From the chemicals that we see in the environment, from the chemicals that are leached into the environment from a wide range of different sources. So we have chemicals that are in land from agriculture, we have chemicals that are in rivers, in watersheds, chemicals that are leaching into coastal estuarine environments. We have chemicals that are ultimately leaching and moving into the ocean from all of those environments. So through the hydrosphere, through the common water cycle that we all share, chemicals are finding their way into the ocean and having an impact, I think importantly, having an impact on all of those environments, but particularly from our point of view, on the ocean environment. Those chemicals are many. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of chemicals that are doing something like, not all of them, of course, are chemicals that are highly toxic, but of course there are many of those chemicals that are clearly highly toxic. So PFAS, what we call forever chemicals. Pesticides, many pesticides, although some of them have been banned, organic chlorines, some of which have been banned, still persistent in the environment. We have chemicals such as heavy metals, and of course Japan has a long history of association with that particular challenge and industrial pollution in Minamata from mercury. We have chemicals coming from all sorts of other sources as well, including nutrient pollution, particularly from nitrogen-based fertilizers, as well as from animal and human sewage. And in that sewage, of course, 90% of sewage globally is not treated. In that sewage, in many instances, there are plenty of other types of chemical compounds, for example, pharmaceuticals that are from the drugs that we take, from the drugs that we give animals, and so on and so forth, are leaching into waterways, into watersheds, and into rivers and into the ocean. So this is an enormous, enormous challenge, I think. And I think that, obviously chemicals are a vital part, a fundamental part of modern life. We cannot exist in many ways without chemicals. About 90% of all of the products and the processes that we have to make those products involve chemicals. And I think that it's important that we understand that, because we use those chemicals every day. They're in our cars, they're in our toothpastes, they're in our health products, they're in our absolutely everything. Every single process, I think, today, and every single product has some sort of chemical in it. And I think that it's important for us to understand that, but also equally important for us to understand that those chemicals are either poisoning us or potentially poisoning us at the same time. And I think what we're here to discuss today is what really is the extent of that pollution. What do we know about it? And what particularly do we know about that pollution as it enters the ocean and as it has an impact both on the ocean environment, ocean ecologies and ocean ecosystems and ocean species, but also how does that come back to us as well through those species? We know, obviously in Japan, this discussion around tuna fish and the high apex predators absorbing a lot of heavy metals, and that comes back into the food chain and food supplies here. But what other things are really happening to the chemicals that are cycled around the hydrological cycle and into the ocean and coming back to potentially harm us as well as other living organisms and animals? So that is the focus of today. We have done a report, The Invisible Wave, that has tried to address, Back to Blue with the Nippon Foundation has done a report, The Invisible Wave, that tries to look at this question. But what we want to look at today is particularly how in Japan this issue has been addressed, if at all, and to what extent there are interesting examples and learnings from elsewhere that are important for the discussion here as it evolves in Japan. So let me, with that brief introduction, let me just introduce Uno Mitsuyuki, who is Executive Director of the Nippon Foundation. I'd like to, first of all, thank the Nippon Foundation for all of the support and work and partnership that it's given us over the last 3 years as we've developed this work. And just to thank the Nippon Foundation for making this event possible. And I'd like to ask Uno-san to come up and make a few comments, please.
Thank you so much, Charles. So speakers, distinguished guests, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to hold this chemical pollution event here in Tokyo as part of Back to Blue, an initiative between the Nippon Foundation and Economist Impact. Lately, I have been getting invited more and more to events that connect the ocean to other fields. These include events that combine ocean and philosophy, ocean and design, ocean and education, and ocean and food. At these various events, there is a phrase that is becoming popular. This is ocean blindness. It describes a state where vital connections to the ocean have been lost, despite the fact that our existence itself depends on this connectivity. Ocean blindness can be interpreted in 3 ways. The first is ignorance, the lack of knowledge and understanding about the ocean. There is so much that we still do not know or understand, not even the expert. Our topic today marine chemical pollution is unfortunately a great example of this. Although the effect on human health and biodiversity have been reported in many parts of the world, major gaps in data collection has made it impossible to understand the true scale and impact. On the other hand, not knowing about the ocean can also be taken to mean not knowing about its full potential. Many of you gathered here today may be working in professionals that are dedicating effort to unlock this unknown potential. When we weigh the positive and negative aspects of revealing the unknown of our ocean, there are only positives. It will not only help us to make better decisions, but also open doors to wonderful possibilities. The second meaning of ocean blindness is indifference. Without interest, there is no thirst for knowledge. On a positive-negative scale, it is a neutral zero. Multiply zero by anything, and one still ends up with zero. The key to bringing about change is to figure out way of getting these neutral people to take that positive step from 0 to +1. Back to Blue also values this point. The third meaning of ocean blindness is disregard. You know there is a problem with the ocean, but you pretend it's not there. You know that you are in some way connected to this problem, but you look the other way. In short, you are turning a blind eye. In positive or negative terms, this action puts something that was already in the negative further down the line. It's something we must all never do. Today, I'm confident that this event will be an opportunity for all of us to renew our understanding of the state of marine chemical pollution in Japan and the world. We may very well have just reached the start line of this difficult challenge. However, from the moment this conference concludes today, we can no longer disregard it. Let us take that first step to overcome the walls of ignorance, indifference, and disregard that make an ocean blindness. I hope that the discussions and the connections made here today can continue to be nurtured on the Back to Blue platform and disseminated globally to inspire more action on marine chemical pollution in Japan and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Una-san, very much indeed. I think there's absolutely no doubt about it, but we share that challenge of ocean blindness in all of the work that we do in the ocean. And we started working in the ocean in 2012 with a World Ocean Summit, the first of our World Ocean Summits in 2012 in Singapore. It is not an easy thing, but I think slowly, as Una-san was saying, slowly we're making some progress. But on this question of marine chemical pollution, I think there's a long, long way to go. And so what we'd like to do is just show you a brief film that we made after the release of our main report, The Invisible Wave. And then after that, we'll come to the next session if you'd just like to play the film. Thank you.
We've already heard about the crisis. That the future is in our hands. With new awareness of how we got here, we are learning to protect our blue planet. But there's more than meets the eye. We know plastics are a real danger to ocean health because they can be seen. Chemical pollutants are nearly invisible and equally, if not more, pervasive. Vital to modern life, we've yet to manage them well. The threat of ocean pollution is accelerating. Our fragile ecosystem can't cope with the confluence of chemicals and plastics together.
We have rising levels globally, and it's affecting even the most remote human populations, food webs.
There are layers of reality we can't see. Chemical pollution and climate change are combining to create a more toxic marine environment. More dead zones are appearing. They're as bad as they sound. We haven't grasped the chemical impact on human health.
Neurodevelopmental delays are now observed in 1 in every 6 children, and they've been associated with many different environmental chemicals.
The economic cost of environmental and biota degradation. It's a vicious cycle we're tangled in. There is a chemical footprint to everything we produce globally. From mining, agriculture, fisheries, to what we wear, what we use, what we throw away. We need a common set of goals to tackle these challenges.
Make sure of what chemicals we put into products, that it's possible to recycle them, and that they're not hazardous chemicals from beginning, because then they will never end. They will always be there.
Humans have created over 350,000 artificial chemicals and mixtures. Thousands more each year, driving modern life forward. With a compounding effect, these chemicals overlap and interact, often with deadly impact. To fix this, we need to understand the chemical economy. Shifting production from richer to poorer countries is costing everyone, and hitting vulnerable communities the hardest.
Many countries do not have the capacity, infrastructure to manage all the emissions.
Investments in petrochemicals as fossil fuel demand slides is just diverting the problem.
Once we cross the tipping point, then it's too late. We really need urgent action by all stakeholders.
There are pathways to resolving ocean chemical pollution. The chemicals industry won't change fast enough on its own.
Chemical pollution is a missing piece. We have a focus on plastics, we have a focus on biodiversity, but all of this is linked.
A healthy ocean is essential to all our lives.
The private sector can move much faster than governments can move. And what we're finding is that safer chemicals are doing much better in the marketplace than the incumbents in the same product category. So there's a win-win here.
More funding is needed to do thorough research, convincing governments to act with science-backed evidence, knowing the costs of inaction to inspire innovation, showing investors economic opportunities, making greener business models necessary.
We will need policies that help move us away from problem chemicals. We also need innovation policies that drive the future of green chemistry and sustainable technologies.
The time is now. Start with our revealing research. Together, we can get back to blue.
Well, I hope that gives you a brief overview of some of the challenges that are faced by chemicals and chemical pollution in the ocean. As I said, please do look at our website, Back to Blue, and look at the report, The Invisible Wave, as well as all of the other work that we've done in addition to that. I think it will, I hope, give you a context that is, at least comprehensive and a start, I hope, to the global discussion, to rethinking and reframing the global discussion around the impacts of chemicals in the ocean. I just want to have, before we get into the first of the interviews with Professor Elsie Sunderland and then the panel discussion, I just wanted to mention a few things about Back to Blue that I think are important. You know, we started Back to Blue as part of our work on the ocean, but it's actually become a centerpiece of much of our work on the ocean, which I'm really delighted to say. And what it's done, I think, is allowed us to address an issue that simply was not being addressed, and that is, of course, chemical pollution. But the whole program is a little bit wider than that. It's brought together two organizations, the Nippon Foundation and Economist Impact, that I think have a generally focused view on using evidence-based work and research to address pressing public policy issues, of which pollution is, of course, a really important one. And of course, it's been our great privilege to work with the Nippon Foundation, which we know does a huge amount of work in the ocean, not just on pollution, but on a range of other things, and the Seabed 2030 program, which is looking to map the seafloor, as well as, most recently, an ocean census program, which is looking to map biodiversity in the ocean. So we are, as I said, deeply privileged to work with the Nippon Foundation around the ocean issues. And I hope that as part of what we're doing, we are now addressing what fundamentally is a quite existential problem. Much of this problem comes from land and drifts into the ocean across the water cycle, particularly, but also comes from cities, from runoff, from roads, from you name it. There are all sorts of different sources of marine chemical pollution. And I think what I would say is that when we decided to start this project, we tried to shape what our objective was in that. And we came up with this particular objective here, and that is to shape and support progress towards zero pollution in the ocean and towards healthy seas as essential to our well-being, to human well-being and prosperity. And part of that effort, and I won't go through all of those points because you can read them, but part of that effort was to ask the question, how do we frame pollution globally as an objective? And of course, we looked at a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different efforts and initiatives around the world to do so, but we came up, and in part sort of derivative from what's been happening in a number of other places, with this idea that we wanted to move towards, over the long term, zero pollution in the ocean environment. Of course, that's a huge ambition. It's not something that we alone can achieve, but I think from our perspective, the idea that we have an ambition and that we share that ambition with a large number of other organizations, and we can work with those organizations to potentially catalyze that ambition, is something that we felt was extremely important for Back to Blue. So what else have we? Well, what is our framing of all of this? What is our, in a sense, our theory of change around this question? I think it's relatively straightforward. We are a media organization. We're a research organization. So, of course, we want to inform people. We want to build the base of research, of evidence, that are going to allow us to have the right kind of conversations with the rest of the stakeholders, with decision makers in particular, about what needs to happen. So that's our first important stage. The second, of course, is engagement. And as The Economist, as the Nippon Foundation, as this joint initiative Back to Blue, we have, I think, a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous platform to be able to engage the global community of stakeholders around this question of chemicals, whether they be civil society, whether they be scientists, whether they be economists, as we're going to be speaking to one a little bit later, whether they be industry and businesses that are engaged around this question. I think The Economist, Economist Impact, and the Nippon Foundation have a tremendous opportunity to engage that crowd. And that's what we have been doing over the course of the last year since we released the first report, The Invisible Wave. We've been building a data pollution a data pollution program that tries to engage all of the parties. I'll speak about that in a minute. And then the third thing, of course, is that out of this process of information, informing, engaging, we hope to catalyze some degree of change and progress. The first of the programs that we have begun, I mentioned this a little bit earlier in my introduction, is around plastic pollution. And so we've created an index, a plastics management index, that looks at 25 countries around the world and looks at their preparedness, in a sense, to be able to manage the question of plastic pollution. We've built a peak plastics program, which is really essentially looking at 3 different scenarios that are being considered by the UN Plastics Treaty process and trying to understand which of those scenarios, either individually or together, would help us reach the ambition that the treaty is trying to reach. Unfortunately, we decided after our work that none of those scenarios, whether alone or together, would in fact help us reach that ambition. So there is a huge task ahead in plastics. And then, of course, last year, and I mentioned this earlier as well, we held the first Global Plastics Summit in Bangkok. And that summit brought together a wide range of stakeholders, including about 60 or 70 countries and their negotiators in Bangkok, to discuss really what are the gaps, what are the missing pieces at this point in time in the global treaty negotiations. And I think most importantly, out of that process came this sense that there isn't enough science, there isn't enough evidence being brought to the decision-making and policy-making process and to the treaty process. And, as I mentioned earlier, there isn't enough discussion around the health impacts of plastics, in particular, the health impacts of the chemicals that are in plastics. So that was the second, I think, really important conclusion. We had a number of other recommendations as well, but I urge you to look at our website to look at those recommendations too. And then, of course, what we're discussing today, and that is the roadmap that we're creating for chemical pollution in the ocean. And we, as I mentioned earlier, we built and did a research report looking the invisible wave, looking at the scale of the problem and looking at some of the solutions and pathways to solutions. And then, since then, we have been engaged in this very ambitious program of engagement across the world with all of the stakeholders to try to build a consensus around what kind of data is needed in order to be able to address this problem and how that data can be put together. And it's one of the interesting findings of that discussion has been that not everything can be done at once. There are too many chemicals and too many issues out there. Rather, we need to focus on those chemicals that we know are creating a serious impact in the marine environment, and then from there move forwards to try to build a broader data process around chemical pollution generally. So we need to look at those things that are actionable and those things that we know that we can move on quickly in order to be able to make some sort of difference. And then I hope that as a result of this process, we are beginning to catalyze a little bit of progress, engagement, getting people interested, getting people talking, and more importantly, I think, getting people, including organizations in the United Nations, the UNESCO IOC, and others, to actually work with us to build a constructive dialogue and a constructive process towards a data map for chemical pollution in the ocean. So it's been a tremendous, I hope, been a tremendous privilege for us to be involved in that work with the Nippon Foundation, as I mentioned earlier, but also an exciting moment, I think, that we're standing at the precipice of a new change, I believe, in the way in which we look at pollution in the ocean. But it requires all of us to do it. We can't do it alone. And indeed, all of the people that have been helping us and advising us, and indeed many of the people that will be sitting with us on stage in a moment, are vital to the process. So, and of course, Japan, which is the focus of our discussion today, is going to be one of those key players globally in addressing this solution, I think. So without further ado, let me now introduce our interview. And our interview, sadly, Elsie Sunderland was not able to make it here to Tokyo today, but she kindly gave an interview with us. This is Professor Elsie Sunderland, who's the Fred Kavli Professor of Environmental Chemistry at Harvard University, and one of our key advisors on Back to Blue. And here is the interview. Thank you. Welcome, Elsie, to today's discussion on the science behind marine chemical pollution. I thought we'd begin by just sort of trying to map out what marine chemical pollution is, where it comes from, and how does it get into the ocean?
Sure. So marine chemical pollution is a pretty broad description of the many different types of pollutants that we have trouble seeing that enter the ocean. So that could be things like nutrients, toxic heavy metals, or broad groups of persistent organic pollutants that we've manufactured for modern commerce. And I forgot.
One of the things that clearly is a problem and a challenge here, and as we wrote about in The Invisible Wave, is that nobody seems to really be thinking too much about this. We know a lot about plastic pollution, which also causes chemical pollution, but we don't know very much about marine chemical pollution. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I really think it comes down to we try to deal with the issues that are most visible and probably most acute that we urgently need to address. And I think all of us are familiar with walking on a beach and seeing some plastic on that beach, and have seen those iconic pictures of seabirds with plastic wrapped around their neck, and those kinds of tragic images are in our head, whereas these chemical pollutants are much more abstract, yet much more potent when we think about the potential health impacts on wildlife or humans. We know about industrial pollution on land where concentrations are very high. And what we don't think about as much is that all of our activities on land eventually reach a river or a stream, which flows downward and eventually into the ocean. And so the ocean is this large sink for all the chemicals that we've produced on land, which cumulatively becomes quite concerning.
Let's come to those impacts in a second, but I think it is quite important just to understand that this is, in a sense, part of a hydrological cycle, isn't it? It's really what we do and produce on land, and how we fertilize our agriculture, how we treat our sewage, and how that gets into water systems in and around land, and then eventually into the ocean. Is that do we need to understand that process better than we do now?
Well, I think we understand the hydrological processes pretty well, and also their connection to the atmosphere. And the atmosphere then through it's not just hydrology, but the atmosphere acts as a conduit to transporting some of these chemicals to very remote regions of the world. And we understand the basic physics of our climate system, but as you mentioned earlier, we don't necessarily understand everything about these chemicals and how they're being transported, beginning with the very first step of, how much are we releasing, where are we releasing it, and then, trying to understand the scope of impacts from this pollution.
And in a general sense, what are the sources broadly of marine chemical pollution? I mean, you've mentioned a few of them: agriculture, nutrients, but how do we start looking for those sources and understanding where this pollution is coming from?
Yeah, well, I would take a step back even from the agriculture and the point sources that we typically think of as pollutants, and think, what is the driving source of the pollution that we're experiencing? And you can break it into two categories. It's usually associated directly with dirty fossil fuels like coal that contain many different pollutants that when we combust them, hundreds are released, and they can be deposited in the atmosphere to marine environments globally or locally. And the other major category is the chemical manufacturing industry, which is, of course, the source of the chemicals being used in different locations and products and things like this, which then eventually end up in our wastewater, in chemicals we're using for agriculture and other things. So, we can, simplifying that source question helps us think about solutions.
And I guess there are, key sectors, as you mentioned, agriculture, the chemicals industry, but also those that manufacture and use chemicals pretty much in every product that is out there at the moment, that we need to sort of understand. Yeah. Excuse me, sorry. In the plastics discussion, I mean, one of the very interesting things that we just talked about at our last event in Bangkok in October last year around, which is there to support the whole process, the international intergovernmental negotiations for plastics, was this really difficult question about how chemicals are put into plastics and what kind of chemicals are in plastics and how those chemicals leach out of plastics into the environment and into us. And I guess plastics is just one area, but one of many areas where products are leaching chemicals and where we need to understand how those chemicals are injected and put into products and how they leach out.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're using, massive quantities of these chemicals in our consumer products. In some cases, we worry about the highest exposures when we interact with those products. But those chemicals leave those products. And it's actually almost when we can't see them when we have to be worried, I would say worry more when we're thinking about the marine environment. Because, I think microplastics have really raised the awareness of this issue for people. And then it's helpful to take a step back and realize that that's a tiny fraction of the numbers of chemicals and quantities of chemicals that are actually present in these different environments.
I think that's a really, really important point. What would you say then, picking up from that, what are some of the negative impacts or some of the impacts really of pollution, particularly marine chemical or chemical pollution in the marine environment, and what makes them so dangerous, do you think, to the marine environment?
Yeah, and I think that's of course the question we all want answered. I think we can think about it in two different ways. We can think of there are a number of systems that have been very heavily contaminated, usually close to sources, close to shore, close to lots of people. And there we tend to see, acute poisoning incidents. So we can see wildlife poisoned. You can have extreme nutrient enrichment and see fish kills, or you can see harmful algal blooms resulting from that. And so that's typically what we think of as most dangerous. I personally would say you can think of high exposures and low relative numbers of populations affected in those cases compared to the global pandemic we're experiencing when we think of global chemical pollution. And so what we're doing that I'm particularly concerned about is raising that low level background exposure to some of these substances that we've never before been exposed to, that we can now measure in wildlife and in humans worldwide. So they're in all of our blood. And we know that they're associated with a whole suite of adverse health effects and chronic diseases that we worry about. So I think there are two different types of scales that we can think about: the acute poisoning incidents that tend to draw our attention, and then the fact that we're all being exposed to these chemicals, maybe not at such a high level, so we don't worry about them as dangerous, but there are low-level chronic impacts on our health and the health of ecosystems.
Could you just tell us a little bit then about what kind of chemicals concern you, particularly in relation to some of those persistent environmental health or human health impacts?
Yeah, I think there's a suite of hundreds of thousands to choose from. I think there are ones that we've studied for a long time that we understand to be particularly worrisome in marine environments because they don't break down. So that, a regulator would talk about those chemicals that are very persistent, meaning they're likely to be around for a long time. So there are lots of chances for organisms to be exposed or us to be exposed through our food. They biomagnify, so they accumulate to high levels in food webs, and toxicity. So we have to think about all of those three things when we're deciding which is most dangerous. And then the things we usually think about are things like mercury and PCBs or organochlorine compounds that we've produced in very large quantities, and lately things like PFAS chemicals.
I know in the United States there's been a lot of focus around PFAS chemicals, and in Europe, of course, there is now a focus there on legislation looking at trying to reduce and eventually eliminate PFAS. But there is this challenge, isn't there, that every time you do legislate or regulate around particular chemicals, the chemicals industry comes up with substitutes around that. How complex is the challenge in front of us to regulate and manage the chemicals that quite often we need, but also which are causing many of these problems?
Yeah, I think that's a great and complicated question. I think the first thing we have to think about is, what do we need? So what is an essential use for these chemicals? And are there more or less toxic alternatives already available in the market? And there are a bunch of switches we could make, which would be immediately helpful. But on a longer time scale, I think there's a sort of a broader challenge to us to go back to that, the starting block and say, how do we manufacture chemicals that we know we're going to use in large quantities in commerce? And how do we design better materials? And how do we educate material scientists and environmental chemists and the communities of people who interact with these things to do this in a smarter way? Because I think that the thing related to persistence that I mentioned a moment ago is, once we see these chemicals in the marine environment or the global oceans, it's really, really difficult to clean them up. So we would be much better off designing better compounds, cleaning them up now.
So starting in a way at the source and making sure that we're able to do this. One of the big challenges of this, of course, is that there has been very little transparency from both the chemical sector as well as all of those other sectors that are using chemicals in the manufacturing processes in buildings and in agriculture and so on and so forth. Very little transparency about what chemicals are being used and what indeed the impacts of those chemicals might be, because many of them have not been tested. That is to be probably the biggest hurdle, isn't it, is to try and agree across society that this is something that needs to be tackled.
Yeah, I agree 100% that the transparency issue is key, especially to regulation, and there's this back and forth. But I do think innovation in materials doesn't require the same consensus, and everybody might be happy. So, but absolutely for the regulatory challenges, I think some of these companies using, this is what we've discovered in the PFAS world, as the companies learn that their products contain large quantities of PFAS, and people are asking for them to be taken out, many of them had no idea that they were there in the first place. So, that is the first step on the consumer end of this challenge.
I guess a sort of an associated question around that is this question of not just transparency and understanding what chemicals are there, but just trying to track and monitor what chemicals are in the environment, and particularly in the ocean itself, which is a vast space and very, very difficult to access most of. What's your thoughts around what we need to start doing in order to be able to improve our understanding and monitoring of chemicals in the ocean?
Yeah. I think that's a great point again. And I think there are a few templates for us out there, things like the Global Estuaries Monitoring Program, where you have a coalition of consistent observations for different classes of chemicals worldwide using the same types of measurements. And the examples that we have are really wonderful, and we've seen, really interesting data coming from those, but they need the support. Those kinds of programs need to be supported by international organizations, around marine pollution and around these issues. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of those types of programs yet. So it'll be wonderful to see those expand.
I mean, we have written about this in The Invisible Wave, to which you contributed as well. And I mean, just briefly, what do you feel the costs of inaction, and the risks of inaction might be?
Yeah, well, I think we'll continue to see this problem, until we take some action on the regulatory front, or until we innovate on the materials front and the chemical manufacturing front, then we'll see this continue to be worse. So we'll see that sort of global pandemic of public health impacts continue to rise. And we'll see, things like our seafood, which is one of our last wild foods, start to be something that we're more concerned about instead of thinking about it as a healthy food choice. We'll see marine food webs compromised. And, none of these things are things we want to see. And so taking action now, I think, is really essential. And I'm so glad you've been doing all this work and getting the word out there with Back to Blue.
Elsie Sunderland, a Professor of Environmental Chemistry at Harvard University, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Charles.
Great. Well, I hope all of that served as an introduction to some of the issues that we're now going to discuss, if my microphone is working. Let me just set out the scope of this discussion. Very simply, I think what we want to try and achieve here is just to understand a bit better what the scope and the extent of the problem of marine chemical pollution is in Japan, and probably also a little bit more broadly what the problem of chemical pollution is in Japan, because the two are clearly, obviously, intimately related. And also think about where the gaps in the knowledge are, the gaps in legislation and regulation are, how the government and how others are addressing these questions. But also, I think, importantly, because we have somebody joining us from outside, two people, Richard and Frida, and I'll introduce them in a second, just try and also get a sense of the global perspective and where Japan fits into the global understanding of this very complex issue. So let me introduce everybody. Right next to me, sitting here, is Suzuki-san, Noriyuki Suzuki, who is a fellow at the Planning Division and Health and Environmental Risk Division of the Japan National Institute for the Environment. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next to Suzuki-san is Richard Damania, who is Chief Economist of the Sustainable, good Lord, where's my notes? Sustainable Development, there we go. Chief Economist of the Sustainable Development Practice Group at the World Bank. And Richard has been doing a lot of work, not just on sustainable development, but on the question of water and how water flows into the environment, and how we look at pollution, particularly in the question of water. And then next to Richard is Yukari Takamura, who is professor of the Institute of Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo.
Very nice
Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. And Richard, of course, has joined us all the way from New York via Frankfurt, I believe. And then last but not least, Frida Hogg, who is on the screen and joining us as she's unable to reach Tokyo itself, but she's the Deputy Director of the International Chemical Secretariat, as we all know, ChemSec, for those of us that are in the chemicals discussion. Frida, thank you very much for joining us there. So let's just begin, shall we? And Suzuki-san, I wanted to just sort of start the discussion off by talking a little bit about Japan and what your understanding is of, I guess, the extent of the problem of chemical pollution in Japan, and whether or not you feel that this is an issue that is both urgent and being treated with some degree of urgency in Japan.
Thank you. It's a very big issue, how to answer on that. But we, Japan, has a long experience on the chemical pollution, but in the more or less local concern in our countries, because we experienced the Minamata disease and several severe incidents on the health problem in our countries. So any chemical pollution issues are more or less focusing on the local issues in our countries. And we have many scientists there and many official work there. But now that now we are talking about the ocean, this could be a more global or world issues, so that we need to more ready to think about chemical pollution in the global context. On that, in our country, we don't necessarily, maybe this is asking of you, I don't know, in our country system is not necessarily very fitting into that global issues, at least in the chemical pollution, or maybe plastic pollutions. I think the issues on the global climate change, our country are more or less related to the global issues, but in the chemical issues, more or less focusing on the local concern is a major concern of any activities. So that one of the, as a scientist, one issues of the urgent is that we need to establish more solid scientific and maybe systems that can manage on the chemicals in the context of the global pollution in the ocean. Maybe in the, as Elsie mentioned, in the combination of the ocean and the atmosphere and the other environment, so that we need such science now. This is urgent needs, and that is, I believe, essential part to think about effective management of chemical pollution in the ocean somehow. I don't know. Is this an answer for you?
Do you? I mean, it is. I think you've raised a number of points, and I think one point particularly is this question of the sense that I'm getting from what you're saying, that science is probably underfunded around the question of chemicals in the environment, and that particularly in the marine environment, I'm probably putting words into your mouth here, but let me do please tell me if I am. Particularly in the marine environment, there isn't enough research and enough focus around that particular question.
The funded, yes, some enough, some not enough. It's because that not necessarily the amount of the funding, but the focus of the funding.
Yeah.
And we need for if we be more active in the global management of chemicals in the ocean somehow, we need more focus of the on the support of the science, so that we scientists can work on to more effectively on the global management of chemicals and plastics in that context.
Well, let me just, if I can, Richard, I'm just going to skip you for a moment and just go straight to Professor Takamura, because I want you to just pick that conversation up, if you could, and just give us your perspective on whether Japan, you feel at this moment, has grasped the scale and extent of the problem, and we had during last year the government decided that it was going to set up 2 expert groups on PFAS, which we were talking about earlier, which Elsie was talking about earlier, and there was quite a lot of criticism, I understand, that the government had not acted quickly enough around that question. So I guess my question to you is, where do you sort of see the necessary priorities, and is the government taking urgent steps to look at those questions?
Thank you, Richard. If I called you such, no, it's Charles. I'm sorry. So, actually, the government or the Ministry of Environment is now elaborating the next basic plan of the environment, in which the Dr. Suzuki also participated in. One of the, I think, key priority that we are actually discussing as a chemical policy, and of course, it's a source of pollution, and which might affect our health and also the health of our planet. So we consider that is definitely one of the priority areas. So the difficulty is that if we grasp the current, how can I say, put this issue forward, I think one of the things that we consider challenge is that the scientific knowledge, because especially talking about the marine chemical pollution, how much this issue actually have an impact on the health of us and also the planet. I think we definitely say that the lack of, or somehow the enhancement of the scientific knowledge and the source of, the chemicals and then the data to make a kind of prediction to make this issue at the forefront of the societal issues. So I think it's quite a challenges, but it's very important to start now.
Do you think there is a general perception, I'm going to stay with Japan just for a moment if I could, do you think there's a general understanding in the population at large, as well as within officialdom and academia, I might say, of the scope and extent of the problem? Is there a feeling that Japan has a big problem with chemical pollution or not?
Maybe other panelists also help me, but I think traditionally the local pollution attracted very much attention here. They're based on our historical experience. But if it go up to the global level, or for instance, the marine pollution is, I think, definitely the pollution on the global commons. But that actually the people still do not aware of the scale and the seriousness of these issues. That's my sense.
Suzuki-san, would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, I think so that she is just right, and at least I share the same feeling with her opinion.
Richard, if I could just come to you. I mean, I want to stay on the scope and scale and extent of the problem at this point in time, and Frida, I'll come to you in a second. I promise I'm not forgetting you on that question. But your own experience looking at the economic impact of pollution in water systems particularly has shown that the extent of the problem is very significant, and that we're still in an early stage, really, of understanding what the implications of that problem is, not just the health implications, but the economic implications. I mean, can you just tell us a little bit about what you've learned through your own research in those areas, and how you would relate that to this question of marine chemical pollution? Because I know you were looking mainly at freshwater pollution. How would you see the two linked?
So let me start with the second question first, because everyone's been talking about that. Chemical pollution. The most fundamental issue that if you're going to try to solve the problem is to know how big the problem is. And we don't know how big the problem is. We don't know the concentration of chemicals, and we don't know the full range of chemicals. To take a very simple example, every year in the United States, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, receives applications to release 1,000 new synthetic chemicals. Every year, 1,000 new synthetic chemicals. And the permission is granted because we have no information that that is harmful. Think of what's happening elsewhere. But the chemical problem doesn't sit on its own. No environmental problem as such sits on its own. Add to that the fact that you have climate change. Add to that the fact that in the oceans you have overfishing. And we know that those things interact, but we don't understand how they interact. We know with climate change you get higher temperatures, that's going to change chemical reactions. We know that's going to destroy fish habitats. And we know that then is going to impair the regulating functions of the oceans. And what do we mean by the regulating functions of the oceans? The oceans play a vital part, not just in terms of what it does of absorbing CO2, but in terms of regulating rainfall, weather, and the entire biosphere, which keeps the world in the safe zone that we are in. So you disturb the oceans too much in any of these ways that we don't understand, you disturb the regulating services that the ocean provides. And that is priceless economically in terms of what damage it would do. Add to that the fact that there's other economic services, of course, that oceans provide, things like jobs and food and health. But remember, when it comes to something like jobs, if we lose jobs, we always know how to recover those jobs. We can find new jobs. You lose the regulating services of the ocean, you don't know how to recover. There's no coming back. And I think that changes the fundamentals of the economics and how you actually think about the value of oceans that has not received anything like the attention that it deserves.
So just a follow-up thought and a question around that is, what is it that is needed, do you think, to provide some sort of economic understanding for policymakers of the scope and extent of this problem, and indeed, in a broader sense, the scope and extent of the regulating services problem and how to quantify that problem for policymakers in a way which they take notice of?
Absolutely. I think the first and most fundamental thing is we need data. We need information. We need to know the extent of the problem. And we don't. And this takes us back almost 15 or 20 years to the fate of the forests. Remember, before we had the satellite data, we didn't know how much deforestation was occurring in any part of the world. The government could tell you there's no deforestation. You had no proof. Today we have satellite data. We can see the trees falling in real time. You want something reasonably similar. You'll never quite get there when it comes to oceans, the health of the oceans, and the ocean pollution. So that's the first thing that you actually need. You don't have the data, you don't have the information, you're not going to get to where you want to be with the science. Secondly, of course, we need to raise awareness. And thirdly, I think it would be really important if the ocean science community, dare I say this, connects more deeply with the rest of the science community that is talking about regulating services, that is talking about climate change, etc., to raise the profile of the issue. It's not merely a fisheries issue. It's a regulating service issue that affects the entire planet and the biosphere. And I think that's got to be the narrative that we try to push.
You raise an enormously important question that we, I think, are very bad at addressing, both as humans and in the way that institutional structures work globally, and that is, how do we link all of the different anthropogenic challenges that we've created together in a systemic way? And how do we think about climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and indeed other impacts that we are probably not particularly aware of at the moment? How do we link all of those together in a narrative, in a systemic way that allows us to address them intelligently rather than separately? I leave that and we'll come back to that. But Frida, can I come to you? Because we think of the work that the European Union does, and I know a lot of the work that ChemSec does is focused around European Union. We quite often think of that European Union as a sort of super regulation state, if you want to put it that way. All sorts of regulations are there around everything. But yet, tell me if I'm wrong, but yet the challenges remain enormous around chemicals. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what you feel the challenges there are and the state of progress that's been made around some of those challenges. And if you can relate it to the marine environment as well, because it's not an area that is particularly, well considered, I think, in the European context.
And thank you for having me. I'm sorry for not joining you in the room. So I think, absolutely. Europe has the strictest chemical regulation in the world, but still, my organization always say that we need more regulation because that's what the challenges are so broad. So this is not something that the market or information campaigns will solve. We need regulation, but we need a lot of things. And I think it's, to the marine pollution, we are all connected via the oceans, right? So this is really a global issue and needs to be handled both on local and global level. That's really important in this issue. And I think when tackling chemicals in products, in overall and overarching regulation, that of course also improve the chemical pollution in the ocean. That also affects the ocean. It has implications also for the ocean, of course, because things end up in the ocean to a large extent. But I think what we have in Europe is also a great challenge to move forward on the regulation, to have them more effective. So it's not that we have solved the problems, but I think hopefully this can also inspire other regions to move ahead with regulation, because that is one step and one way of dealing with this problem. But it needs to be dealt with in many different ways, and legislation is one. So I think, we have a huge challenge with this PFAS restriction that we are working on, which is definitely affecting the oceans, as we are talking about these persistent chemicals.
So one thing I've sort of picked up on in the European discussion, which the Invisible Wave, our report picked up on, is this question of to what extent chemicals are monitored in Europe as they leach into the environment in some way or another and then find their way into the ocean. And what surprises me, I think, is that the range of chemicals that is actually monitored by environmental agencies across the European Union are relatively narrow and relatively contained. And I wonder if we simply do not have the right picture of chemical pollution across Europe? Or do you think we have prioritized the right chemicals and that's really where we need to be? Or do you think the number of chemicals and the kind of chemicals that we need to look at needs to be expanded?
It's a very good question. I will never contest that we need more information. I certainly agree to that. But we have enough information to act. And I think that is very important, because if we will sit back until we have a full picture, well, that will be very hard to get, because we're talking about hundreds and thousands of chemicals in different formats. And as you said, when something is regulated, the chemical industry will find another one. And that is one of the good things about the chemical industry. They are very good at innovation. And what we like to steer them towards is, of course, better, safer, and more sustainable chemicals. So what is also a problem is also a strength from the industry side. But I think monitoring is, of course, important. Sometimes we feel that you put too much emphasis on getting the full picture and monitoring and talking about what you find, instead of talking about to get rid of things in the first place, because that is more a difficult political decision to take than talking about the problems at the end. So I think we need to be a bit balanced here, so to say that we need to act now.
We have enough information in front of us to be able to act now. I wonder whether we still need a little bit more understanding of what some of the impacts are. And I think, picking up from your point, Frida, that, in some ways, and it's a point that we've been I think, understanding as we've done a lot of these engagement groups globally, and that is that it's perhaps not important to try to track every chemical and understand what every chemical is doing in the environment. We do, in fact, have knowledge, as Elsie was also saying, about which chemicals have a certain level and kind of impact in the environment and on human health. And actually, it would be important really to focus on the impact, the chemicals that we know have an impact, and try to address those. I know you've just effectively said that, and I'm repeating what you said, but can I just come to Takamura-san, Professor Takamura? Do you see that as being something that Japan, at this point in time, is clear about? That we know what chemicals make and have an impact on health, on environmental and human health, and there isn't necessarily a need to do too much more science, although that's important, but we know what we need to know to act.
I definitely expect that Dr. Suzuki's, complementary comment from the scientists. But I think I totally agree with in a sense, it's quite difficult to manage chemicals because we need the more, how can I say, the sufficient or enhancing knowledge to manage the chemicals. But at the same time, we have to act, as Frida mentioned. There are the chemical with high concern, even though there is some uncertainty from the science. I think we could do something. For instance, under I think the environmental policy, we adopt, like I think European Union, the precautionary principle. We, of course, we need the scientific basis and evidence, but especially about the chemicals, often involving some scientific uncertainty about the impact, exact impact, if I may. In that case, we have to do something to manage such kind of risk with uncertainty. That is, I think, one of the pillars of our environmental policy.
Let me just pick up on that point, if I may. And Suzuki, Professor Suzuki, can I come to you and just ask you, this question about, yes, we do some testing on chemicals. Yes, we even do some testing in the marine environment on chemicals, but very limited testing. Do we, and yes, as Richard was saying, 1,000 new chemicals in the US are emerging every year. I have no idea how much it is in the European Union or in Japan. It must be a similar amount. Thousands of new chemicals are coming out every year, which are probably not tested, or if they are tested, they're only tested in a very minimal way. What is it that needs to happen? I mean, there are so many chemicals arriving on the market. How do we address the need to assess the toxicity of those chemicals before we let them into the market, i.e. the precautionary principle? How do we apply the precautionary principle from a scientific point of view?
I must say, maybe too scientific or maybe too in-depth. I have a personal talk in my institute with an epidemiologist who may closely working on the global burden of diseases on the humans. Maybe you know. And his work is somehow related to that burden of diseases to be associated to the atmospheric pollution. And that epidemiology works well somehow. And maybe some of you know that there is some apparent impact as other numbers appears from the scientific literatures. And in the chemicals you discussed is, in my internet talk, his feeling is that chemicals may give at least apparent impact to the atmospheric pollution as in terms of global burden diseases, but he cannot do that because that, as you mentioned, we have a lot of variety of chemicals, so that he cannot select the appropriate incident parameters or chemicals that should be that is going to be associated to the outcomes, health outcomes. And also the health outcomes are also very diverse. Health outcome in the humans is very diverse, and also health outcome to the environment is more diverse because we have many biota in the environment. So these two types of dimensions of wide variety, I think this is my personal feeling as a scientist, is one key difficulties that chemical pollution is not necessarily well managed as a whole in the global context. And sorry, we scientists don't, at least in my understanding, we don't have a very good solution to that. And as you mentioned, we have only very less number of testing or information or anything on the within the whole number of chemicals. Probably we have a number less than 1% of the data we only have. So that, no, I don't have any ideas that at this moment, my personal or some assumptions or strategy of our group is that we need to select the appropriate surrogate in every time, because the chemicals is always changing year by year. So always select the appropriate surrogate to that and monitor that, test that, and hope to find out to, how to say, estimate or forecast the whole impact from that surrogate. We need to work on the science somehow, but not successful. And also, we ask that government or management side to ready on that such a scientific information with substantial uncertainties that may include the precautionary principle, maybe any of that. And so that, yeah, sorry, I don't have clear answer, but that is my own thinking on how we are going to cope with chemical pollution in the ocean with the varieties in several dimensions.
I mean, I don't think there is a simple answer to this question at all. But Richard, can I come to you, because obviously you raised the issue in some ways about saying that 1,000 new chemicals are coming onto the market. Is it plausible and possible to test and manage all of those chemicals that are coming onto the market as a system, in a system that's devised to do that? Or do we need to look at, as Elsie, I think, was suggesting, a system in which a transition towards more sustainable chemicals and green chemicals based on some sort of precautionary principle is affected, and we need to put, rather than trying to look at every single chemical in detail, economically, what would be the best sort of approach to managing chemicals that are coming onto the market and thinking about how to deal with them?
So the ideal solution would be Elsie's solution in the long run, that we only invent and use chemicals that are safe. Yeah. That's in the long run. That's a very, very long way away. Yeah. The reality that we actually confront today is a little bit different. It's decision-making under uncertainty. Yeah. And what we have to recognize, of course, is that the reason why we have this problem is that the chemicals are giving us things that we like and we want. Everything that I use around me is generating something which probably ends up in the ocean. So it's a matter of balancing the benefits and the costs. The difficulty that we have is that the impact is uncertain. For most of the chemicals, we don't know precisely what the impacts are. We know that they're bad to some extent, but we don't know how bad they are. And this is rather like, I guess, a decision that doctors make all the time. For a patient that has cancer, the oncologist needs to trade off. Do I do chemotherapy, which can potentially harm the patient, or do I allow the cancer to proceed, which will also harm the patient? And it's a little bit like that for the regulator. Do I stop the production of all these things, or do I regulate it? And I think what we really need to do is to have, if you like, a rational, a balanced risk management strategy. Also remember that the more you try to regulate that risk, the greater will be the resistance to your regulation. So you really need to be very, very well balanced in what you do and have reasonably good evidence. And I don't think there's any substitute for doing the science and getting the evidence out to say, okay, we didn't know when we allowed this chemical what the impacts are. 10 years on, as the evidence accumulates, we are getting more and more and more. And you will never get exactly all the information that you want, but you'll get reasonably close over time as more and more information accumulates. So it's fundamentally a risk management strategy. and it's one where I don't think we can underestimate the importance of measuring, doing the science and doing the statistics to work out what's happening.
Frida, can I get you to pick up on that point? Because I know there's been a big discussion in Europe around this question of, is it a risk management strategy or is it the precautionary principle, and how do the two work together? What are your thoughts around this?
Well, there are so many thoughts, but I think maybe a good way of sort of starting is to focus on the most harmful chemicals. I mean, the persistent one, the cancer-causing ones, etc. So we have, because we're not talking about all chemicals, because that would be that's sort of too big, and maybe we don't need to handle that. But focus on the most harmful chemicals and make sure they don't end up on the market, but also to get them out of our products. And we know that we have all these things we like and are sort of part of our modern society. But at least we need to start to phase it out where it's not necessary. Because in many ways, for example, PFAS, it's been used or is still used in cosmetics. It's just used because it gives a nice feeling. Okay, so that's not really necessary. But it can still be necessary in, batteries or semiconductors. There are a lot of things happening, so we're hoping to get alternatives, but for the moment, it might be difficult to find alternatives. I think it's also really important to spur the market, to get the market on board and spur the market that finds the better alternatives, safer alternatives, and make sure there are economic benefits for the companies who actually find and produce and innovate these alternatives. And that is not really happening now. And of course, regulation is something that can drive and spur that innovation, but it hasn't really happened to the extent that we want to and need, really, because we need a movement here. And that will not happen by itself. So we need different ways to push the market and the chemical industry to find and innovate towards safer alternatives and to phase that. And I think, public information is also very important, to people know, and not just people on the streets, but also companies, that every company take responsibility for what they sell, what they produce, just phase out and have a plan moving forward. Because as long as we are moving forward, that is a lot better than sitting back.
The European Union obviously has quite a well thought through chemical strategy. It has legislation in the form of REACH. But of course, that itself is not going to move chemical companies to make an accelerated transition towards green chemicals. What do you feel is going to be needed in terms of additional effort and to make progress around the transition to green chemicals?
I think what we haven't succeeded with in Europe is really this that I mentioned, the market, to push the market and to give them benefits for the ones that produce the alternatives. We haven't been able, with the legislation and the chemical strategy, to give them credits for moving ahead and incentives, really. And I think if that could be strengthened, and there are ideas in the chemical strategy, but the chemical strategy is just a strategy. It's not it's a road forward, but it's not a law yet. So, we still have a huge problem with PFAS also in Europe. So even if we have the strictest chemical regulation in the world, we still have the PFAS pollution. Hopefully we can be able to regulate now with the restriction within REACH, but we still have the same problem.
Let me just pull that question out back to you, Professor Takema, and then to you, Richard, and that is this question about, is there been enough consideration given to the development and incentivization of green chemistry here in Japan?
I think it's now they're considering, especially within the framework of the green transformation. So, of course, that's triggered by the climate change action, but it's really linked with Also the protection of biodiversity and ecosystem, and also the tackling the pollution, including chemical pollutions. For instance, one of the areas that the government wish to focus is that the kind of the circular economy, because it's chemical, of course, is also in the product and the production process, and also the waste. And then that's kind of whole life cycle of the chemical should be managed and assessed. I think that within the framework of the green transformation, that of course enhances the climate action and also circular economy, but definitely reducing the pollution. So we consider that it's one of the drivers for the restructuring economy and our society.
I could pick up on so many issues there, and one of those issues is this question of plastics and the way, I guess, Japan sees a sort of recycling approach in economy towards plastics, contrary to what I think many other countries feel needs to be the kind of more systemic approach to it. But there's not enough time for that discussion, I think, at the moment. But can I come to you, Richard, with the same question? Because I think one of the great challenges, and Elsie mentioned this in her discussion, her thoughts, was that the transfer of a lot of chemical production has gone to developing countries. And from Europe and from America and from Japan. And the challenge there is that most of those countries have very weak regulation systems, and that there's very little and poor oversight and transparency around these chemicals. The World Bank obviously is focused on developing countries. How the frameworks that we've been talking about, the EU frameworks, the frameworks in Japan, are relatively well developed, and they're sophisticated frameworks that are designed to address questions in advanced economies. How are these questions going to be begun to be addressed in the developing world? Because I think this is a really big challenge, isn't it?
It's a really big problem. Before that, if you don't mind, if I can just add a little bit about the idea about innovation and the green chemicals. And perhaps there's something we can learn a little bit from the climate change space, and the economics is reasonably clear. We can think of two sorts of cases. One, a new technology exists. So think about solar panels. The technology existed, and all you had to do was to create a market, for example, in Germany, and there was a manufacturer somewhere in the world that could really bring down the costs of solar panels so that it becomes affordable to everyone. There'll be some chemicals in that category. But then there will be many more, I suspect, and this is pure intuition rather than knowledge, or guesswork rather than knowledge, where we don't have the equivalent of a solar panel. We don't know what the alternative is. We don't know what the green alternative is. There, I think you really do require much more public support, carrots and sticks. And if the economics is to be believed, the sticks is not going to suffice. You do need the carrots for that innovation in the public universities and elsewhere to actually get that going. So I wanted to answer that question. Your second question is really fundamental, because so much of some of the most hazardous production is occurring in developing countries, in middle-income countries and lower middle-income countries. And very often what you see in these countries is countries might actually have the legislation, but not the means to actually enforce the legislation. But I think that there is a little bit of good news in all of this. And the little bit of good news is in terms of technology. A few years ago, for example, it was very difficult to monitor the amount of pollution. Today, we do have sensors. They might be a little bit expensive, but the price can actually come down, where in real time you can monitor at least key emissions and key chemicals that are actually put out by firms. Then you, of course, have the problem of enforcement. There are countries, I won't mention which ones, where you can have firms in violation of whatever the agreement is, whatever the allowable amount of pollution is. They're very happy to pay the fine and to keep polluting. And it's in the academic journals. You can go and read which countries these are, all over the place. So that becomes important as well, right? That you need to have some sanction. There's no point in saying that I have this rule and you simply pay the fine and you actually keep polluting. So we need to get to that. And maybe again, if you look at economics and you look at the technology, there are some promising solutions around. And one solution is something like a cap and trade. No one believed, for example, that a cap and trade could work in a developing country like India for PM2.5, which is air pollution. And there has been an experiment which has been remarkably successful, more successful than many a developed country, where they did have a cap and trade scheme. How does that work? For those that don't know what I'm talking about, the government says you're only allowed to pollute, say, 100 units, everyone. Suppose you don't need to produce anything today, your market has fallen. Or suppose you're very good at reducing pollution. You only pollute 50 units. You've got 50 units to spare. You can sell that to me and make money out of it. So people are making money out of reducing pollution. And it ended up being extremely popular and working extremely well. So where we have these clusters, we often have clusters of pharmaceutical industries producing a lot of stuff that's really quite toxic. Mm-hmm. You can think about solutions like this, so long as you have the enforcement. The key to that working was, of course, you needed to have the enforcement and the transparency over there. So I think while it's actually, things are changing, I think there are promising solutions. I think we need to be a lot more innovative about them, because you're not going to be able to stop that trend from actually occurring.
Well, let me just pause there and let's take a little bit of a leap. I realize we don't have a lot of time left, but 15, 16 minutes. And think about what some of the global approaches to this question of managing chemical pollution might be. And of course, we're in the middle of a process at the moment on plastics. We're in the middle of a global treaty negotiation on plastics, which at the moment I have to say I'm feeling somewhat pessimistic about, but nevertheless it is what it is. We have a number of global organizations that are focused on chemicals, including NGOs such as yourself and a number of UN bodies that are focused on this question. What do we think might be a sensible architecture globally for addressing chemical pollution? Is it going to be a scientific architecture where we do an IPCC for chemicals? Is it going to be a UN treaty on chemicals? What kind of approach is likely to work best globally at the global level to try and coordinate the work that's going on globally in different countries, the European Union being a good example, but also Japan and others, to really begin to address chemical pollution? And Frida, I'm going to come to you first, and then I'm going to come back to the panel here.
Well, that's a really difficult question, because I think actually an international convention, a global treaty, is a good way to go. They will never be very ambitious, but at least it's sort of, you have a common baseline, which is a good start, better than we are today on marine pollution. And it also puts spotlight on the issue, which is also an important factor here. I mean, I also hope that maybe from such a base, you could build chemical legislation within the different countries, and hopefully with support from each other, that regions go together and have this more or less similar, requirements, because that could also be very useful. And then I think, we need to think also on a global level how we can support the chemical industry to move in the right direction. And I think, for example, to have more information. We have a network with investors that are very interested in the chemical issue. They want to push the chemical industry. That's, of course, one way of pushing the industry to act more responsible in this area.
So there's no easy answer there, of course, is there?
There are no easy answers.
I mean, as you say, how much utility is a global framework for something? Is the global framework for plastics going to provide the kind of ambition that's needed? Or can we accept a slightly lower ambition in the treaty, because of what it might mean globally for the way in which momentum is built to make progress. And I throw that to you, Professor Takamura, and just ask you whether or not you feel, there is a utility in these globally conceived agreements.
I think definitely this issue, the global chemical pollution, especially marine pollution, needs some kind of global platform. Whatever the legal status is, legally binding or not. Usually, as all know, that the negotiation for the international convention takes time, so that facing the urgency of the issues, maybe we could take a kind of step-by-step approach, create a global platform. Maybe that is not legally binding, but that we could start the creating such kind of global basis foundation for the tackling the chemical pollution and the marine chemical pollution. So, which the platform provide a kind of science center in a sense. The scientific knowledge on chemicals somehow they dispersed. So then somehow they accumulate or manage these kind of scientific knowledge and data. And also, especially I'm talking about ocean. Ocean is very complex, in terms of ecosystem, but also, as you know, the jurisdiction. So in that sense, I think we definitely need international cooperation, which assists, that will be the global platform, could assist such kind of the enhancement of the international cooperation as a first step.
Richard, your thoughts, would you agree with that?
So I think there is much merit in having some kind of global institutional architecture, and one where science can come together and, as the professor said, to spotlight the issue. But the reality is, David, as you expressed your frustration, is these things move at a glacial pace, particularly if you're trying to get agreement amongst countries whose interests don't align. We've seen that in climate change, and we'll keep seeing that in other fora too. And I wonder, given that reality, whether we need to think a little bit more creatively. So we can think, you can have your global platform, but you might want to think beneath that of having clubs of the willing, countries that actually want to act. That would be one way of proceeding. Another, that we could take a leaf out of the book of global diplomacy. Just because we don't see eye to eye on one issue doesn't mean that we don't see eye to eye on all issues.
Yeah.
And the idea there is something called global diplomacy or game theory. It's called issue linkage. I want to have you reduce pollution. You don't want to reduce pollution, but you want access to my markets. We can link those issues, or whatever they might be, and we both get something of what we want. We don't get everything of what we want. And we haven't really gone down that road for a variety of reasons in the environmental domain, to actually recognize that the global solutions are tough, very, very tough. But there are other solutions, second, third best they may be, but at least they get you progress, to get you to where you want to go. So I would talk about being more innovative in this area.
Is that in some ways where the Global Plastics Treaty is going? Because I think that the risk at the moment in front of the Global Plastics Treaty is that it's not going to be anything like as ambitious as some people wanted it to be. But out of that may come, in a way, a coalition of the willing, a coalition of countries that decide that they're going to set a base set of standards and a base set of goals and aims that they want to achieve. And out of that, progress may be made with the overarching framework that the global treaty might create.
Absolutely, and then you can have issue linkage.
Yeah.
One great example of issue linkage, as unpopular as it is in some circles, is the European Union carbon border adjustment mechanism, a tariff, right? That's not the only way of linking issues. There's other ways, there's carrots as well. But that would be the virtue of it, is you're not waiting for the slowest party to sign on. You can proceed without that.
So, Suzuki-san, can I come to you and just ask you from a science point of view, what do you feel? I mean, there already is a proposal out there globally for a scientific process to take shape around a monitoring process to take shape around chemicals. It's still under discussion at UNEP. It hasn't been fully passed and enacted at the moment at the UNEP General Assembly. But do you see there being a need, an urgent need to bring science together around the question of chemicals so that we can at least have a foundational set of data and considerations to work on?
Yeah, I don't assume this in my own scenario talking, and because this is an issue of marine pollution. But you may remember that we had 2 resolutions at UNEA at the same time for plastic treaty we started. And the second resolution was on the establishment science policy panel on chemicals, pollution, and waste. Yeah. And I am more or less working on that. And this is just in the discussion, so anything not yet decided. So that as my personal views, at least as a scientist, we need to sound venue to somehow discuss, share all scientific basis to be a basis of any management or policies to be used. And it means that, first you said that there is a lot of institutions on the chemical managing in the global IGOs or treaties, anything. And I personally hope that this new SPP on chemical waste and pollution would be the venue to establish shared scientific views, information, or methodology, or anything that can be a basis to the more concerned work of every IGO's activity, or maybe national work. That is, I think that IPCC and IPBES is somehow working on that. And I hope that in chemical, as on the scientific point of view, in the field of chemicals and pollution, I think it is urgent, we have urgent need to establish some of the comparable structures that science can share the more consistent views to give to the policy side.
Yeah. I mean, I think you raise a couple of points there. One is that quite clearly there is a need for it, but to what extent is the the marine chemical pollution discussion a subset of a wider discussion about chemicals? And I think it probably is. And we've talked about this quite a bit today, and that is the sense that, the large majority of chemical pollution in the ocean comes from land-based sources. And unless we address those, we're not going to address marine chemical pollution at all. So I think if there is a science process, the ocean probably needs to fit somewhere in that process. I mean, we've been looking at this question of data and marine chemical data, and I think from a data point of view, it might work that there is some sort of separate process that allows us to gather and share and build a knowledge of what's happening in the ocean. But I think from a broad scientific process, it seems to me that there needs to be a collective effort around chemicals. Would you agree or disagree with that, Frida?
No, I would agree with that. Definitely. I think, the oceans are really gathering everything that we put out everywhere. So, it's really, really important. But I think it's also can also connect us in a very sort of clear way. Yeah.
Takamura-san, do you see that as a...
Yeah, I think I agree with Dr. Suzuki. That's and also the Charles, and for the science basis, I think we need some kind of comprehensive approach, not only focus on the marine pollution, because marine pollution is caused by often through the territory and also the air, so that we need to grasp the comprehensive the knowledge on that. And at the same time, I could say that especially the regulatory perspective, special focus should be on the global marine chemical pollution, because that's definitely necessary the international cooperation. So in that sense, I think one of the clear focus of the maybe chemical pollution is on the marine, ocean chemical pollution. And that's, while addressing this issue, we could also see the other chemical pollution, for instance, as I said, on the land. So I think it's a very good window and the entry point to address the global chemical pollution.
I think that does make a huge amount. Sorry to see people always agreeing with me, but but thank you. But I think that makes a lot of sense, it seems to me, and I wish we could persuade the ocean community to think a little bit more broadly about its connection to the rest of the well, particularly the land, the terrestrial discussion around this. I think without that, I think we are going to fail in addressing marine chemical pollution. And we have to recognize that this is a land-based discussion, that discussion is also, as Frida was suggesting, also quite advanced at this point in time. And there's a lot of regulation around it, there's a lot of discussion around it. There isn't really a lot yet of connectivity between the land-based discussion and the ocean discussion, and I think that's probably where some new work needs to be done, but it strikes me that there is already a well-formed and well-informed discussion that is there that the ocean needs to link into. Well, look, we're almost at the end. I mean, any final thoughts, Frida? I know you're there in. Are you in Sweden?
Yes.
Yeah, in
yes,
Sweden. I know you're there in Sweden. Any final thoughts before we sort of close up?
Well, I'm very glad to have this discussion because I think the ocean is something that really affects us all. It connects us all, but it also sort of is our garbage bin in some ways because everything ends up in the ocean, and we are dependent on it. And to talk about chemicals and how we move that forward to have more safe and sustainable chemicals, that's really, really important. And really like what you said with the carrots and the stick, we need both to really have a path forward.
I would agree. Briefly, before we sort of go to the floor to ask for questions from the floor, Takamura-san, any last thoughts around this?
I think you already beautifully, wrap up. But I think this global chemical issues is it's a really touch on our house and our planet. So as you know, that there is now the concept of planetary health. I mean, that shows that our health is very much linked with the health of planet. So global marine chemical pollution issue is a kind of typical issue. And if we could also make this visible to the public, I think we could get more enhancement of policy at the domestic level and the international level.
Richard.
Take off on your last point is about, I would hazard a guess, about 90 to 95% of the pollutants in water come from land or some land-based activity. Therefore, the solution lies on land. And not only that, so much of the damage before it actually occurs in the ocean is actually occurring on land, whether it's through water on land or whether it's through pollution, air pollution on land. And therefore, looking at that entire chain of damage, that negative value chain, is what's going to draw attention to the ocean pollution problem, not simply focusing on what's happening on the ocean. And that's also going to help you to make the economic case why you should worry so much about the oceans. That's my one point. My final point is, please don't forget, not only is the ocean this great big dumping ground, but it is this profoundly important regulating service. It is the service that ensures that the climate system is within a stable range that makes things livable. It ensures that your forests persist the way they are and that you can farm where you can because so much of your rainfall is also dependent upon it, in addition to things like the fish, etc., that people actually eat. So it's a profoundly important, what people would call regulating service. It keeps us within that safe zone where humanity can actually flourish. Let me stop.
Incredibly important point. Suzuki-san.
I cannot say any additional thing, but I think that as already mentioned, that I see that the ocean is a location of every waste pollution is come together, but also simultaneously that is a place that any next production utility appears from that. But that is a very important point to think about. And if we are looking at marine pollution, it may be important as itself, and also maybe an example to give important implication to any global issues. It's a very general comment.
Well, look, thank you. And I want to throw this open briefly to the floor, if I can, because I'm sure that there are some questions and thoughts from the floor. Naka Kondo-san is going to translate anybody that would like to ask a question in Japanese. But we've got 5 or 10 minutes to just explore some thoughts and questions from the floor. Kobayashi-san. Could you just get us... Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Kobayashi from Ocean Policy Research Institute of Sasaka Peace Foundations. I have a question to Mr. Richard Domanier. That I think this precautionary approach it seems to be very important, but at the same time, I tend to think that there's now a tendency to place a burden of proof on the environmentalists, that they have to prove that there is a harm or in the application of particular chemicals. If we really follow this precautionary principle, it may be also the case that burden of proof should be also placed on the producers or the user of the agrochemical, that they have to prove that there is no harm in the application of the chemical. And in the case of rice-producing countries like Japan or Southeast Asian countries, they use these agrochemicals in the rice-producing paddy field. That seems to be the source of pollutant, harmful agrochemicals adversely affecting coastal and estuary ecosystem rather than continental agro systems. So I just wondered if you can shed some light on how we can really approach this precautionary principle and maybe burden of proof issue. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really, really important point, and thank you for bringing it up. In an ideal world, we would be exercising the precautionary principle, and there would be a burden of proof on the people that are potentially doing the harm. The reality that we actually live in is we can have very good evidence of harms that are actually done, and yet it's very, very difficult to control the pollutants. You brought up rice and agrochemicals. There's so much evidence, accumulating evidence, for example, of nitrogen. Now, we know nitrogen fertilizer is really important for productivity. Most of it is subsidized. We use so much nitrogen around in the world, especially in parts of East Asia and South Asia, that it actually hurts productivity. But not only that, a lot of that nitrogen flows into water. High doses of nitrogen cause blue baby syndrome, which is lethal to children. On lower doses than the 10 parts per million, it can cause stunting, that is, children fall sick, they don't grow to their full height potential, or mentally they don't grow to their full potential. Think of the economic costs of that. In developed countries, very developed countries, we have good correlation. Those other two were causal. This is statistical correlational evidence of high levels of nitrogen, various kinds of cancer, and thyroid problems. Despite that, the regulation is very, very, very difficult. The point of that anecdote was you can have the evidence, but to actually get the regulation and then to enforce the regulation is enormously difficult. And I think that's the reason why we're so far away from where we actually need to be. So I don't wholly answer your question, but that's the reality that we're in.
I wonder if I could just ask Frida for you to comment on this, because the precautionary principle is one of the foundations of the transition that Europe is trying to make around chemicals and towards greener chemicals. How do you see that operating in Europe, and is it at the moment being at all recognized and at all successful in the early stages of its implementation?
Very good question. It's just as difficult in Europe as elsewhere to apply that precautionary principle. It's part of our regulation, and it should sort of be the one of the guiding principles. But it is actually, in fact, in reality, when you're taking decisions, very hard to apply because it's more a political or a sense than something with numbers or facts or very, very clear frames. And it has been shown that the precautionary principle hasn't really been used as it was expected in Europe. Now they are looking into how could you do that? How can you implement it in a more stringent way, or really understand how do you actually do this? Because it's a very nice thought and good thought and important, but very difficult to apply in real life, just as Richard say.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Please do. You can find a microphone here, please. Just mention your name and organization. That would be.
日本語でいいですか?
I think Yaka, you might.
日本語でよろしいでしょうか。私20数年前から、病院排水を研究してまして、病院の排水には病原菌と、医薬品が含まれています。それが世界中の病院からは、病原菌も医薬品消毒薬ももろに捨てられています。世界中が捨てられています。で、私どもで、20数年前から特許を取りまして、病原菌と医薬品を分解する装置を作ったんです。で、日本で43カ所大学附属病院とか国立病院とか赤十字病院とか入れてるんですけども、何せその法律がありませんから入れる方の責任であって、やはり、先ほどもちょっと話ありましたけども、陸上の出口で阻止する、出口でストップするということが非常に大事なことではないかと思ってます。で、時間もあれですからですけど、日本財団の方と一緒に私、このように英語ができないもんですから世界中に広めるためにお手伝い願えればありがたいと思ってます。病原菌のデータだとか、それは国立大学だとか北立場大学だとかとデータを取りました。医薬品の分解に関しては問題なくある大学と共同してやってますんで、病院排水に関してはほとんどきれいなものになって水になって出ます。それを世界に広めることができれば病院排水だけが悪いと言ってるわけじゃないんですけど、今一番やっぱり、パンデミックになってて、次のパンデミックが起きた時にはスーパーバグが起きて、医薬品が効かなくなるという状態のが今日本でも現実進行してます。例えば、極端に言うと性病をですね、梅毒とか淋病とかそういう関係は、全く、抗生物質が効かなくなっています。で、死ぬしかない、長期入院するか死ぬしかないということになってます。それを、こんな私にとってはいい商品がありますんで、 日本財団さんと一緒に世界に広めるべくご協力願いたいと思っております。以上です。
はい、ありがとう。I think could we have the microphone here, please? Oh, you've got it. Great.
I didn't catch, I don't think he mentioned the title, but we'll get back to his name and title. But basically, he's been, for 20 odd years, they've been looking at sewage coming out of hospitals and these institutions. And of course, in these sewage, we got pharmaceutical chemicals and viruses, and they're just all slushed out all over the world. And this is happening. This is a practice that's happening all over the world. And they now have patented technology to basically, I think it's a filter system, to get these viruses and pharmaceuticals kind of cleansed of the sewage. And they've succeeded in getting these sewage water completely clean, almost, very, very clean. And his ideal, in the ideal world that he would like the support of the likes of the Nippon Foundation to spread these technologies. But of course, the issues are that there are no regulations really around this. And I think in the long term, what is going to happen is that another pandemic will hit. And, we've got all these antimicrobial resistance issues on the horizon. Yes, and so I guess it was not necessarily a question, but I think it's raising an issue.
I think it's a very important comment.
And I might just ask for his name and title.
Could we do that after? Because I think we're just running out of time here. But I just want to thank you for raising that question and raising that issue, because it is, I think, a hugely important one. And actually an issue after my own heart, because I look at antimicrobial resistance, and I'm very concerned about antimicrobial resistance. And I think the pandemic has taught us that actually through sewage, we can understand a lot about the nature of the pandemic itself, as well as the nature of antimicrobial resistance and a range of other things that are connected to that. And so this is, if you look at studies of, say, estuaries, there is an enormous problem with antimicrobial resistance building in estuaries, directly as a result of the resistance that's developed on farms through the use of antibiotics, as well as in hospitals, as well as in the general antibiotics that we use and is in our sewage. So I just want to thank you for raising that. I mean, it is and should be an important part of the overall discussion for chemicals in the marine environment as well as in the hydrological cycle. I don't know if anybody wanted to just comment on it, but if not, we have run out of time. And I do apologize, we have to stop there. I know everybody is anxious to make sure that they get trains before it starts snowing again. But first of all, let me thank our panelists. Let me thank in Sweden, Frida Haak, from Chemsec. Thank you so much for joining us, Frida. Let me thank Yukari Takamura, Professor Takamura, for joining us, Noriyuki Suzuki for joining us, as well as Richard Demania from flying all the way from Frankfurt here to join us today. Please join me in thanking all of the panelists. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I hope that you felt that it provided you with some new insights onto a very, very important question, I think, and one that is underrepresented in the overall discussion on pollution. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. All of those people in the room, of course, as well as those online joining us today as well. Thank you so much for your time and for your patience. And I want to thank, finally, the Nippon Foundation, our partner in this process, who have given us all sorts of important support, intellectually and otherwise, to move forward in this program. Thank you all, and we look forward to the next one. If we are able to bring another one here as well, we look forward to that, I hope. Thank you. very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.